Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Sebbing. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to make block 9 in the Dimensions Block of the Month series. This month we are going to a hot pink fuchsia ombre fabric from Kinkame Shades by Clothworks. Again, we are getting all of this color variation from one strip of fabric. Isn't that cool? I love it. Alright, so just like last month, we are going to start by cutting these rectangles into triangles. And that is because in order to get the color variation to go from the bottom of the triangle to the top of the triangle, we have to first cut it vertically across the width of fabric. And then we have to cut off the corners in order to get that color change to go from the bottom to the top. And don't worry, we have a use for all those triangles. I hope you have been saving them and sewing them together with scant 1/4 inch seams and trimming them down all along, because we're going to do an improvisationally pieced pillow. That is a mouthful. An improv pillow at the end to match your quilt. So that'll look really cool on your bed or your couch or wherever you display your Dimensions quilt once it's all done. Let's get started. So when I cut these, I just kept them in color order, so I knew which one was the darkest and the lightest in the bottom of the fabric and the top. So I kept that all in order, and then I'm just gonna pull them out in order as well. So I have the bottom of the fabric where it's the darkest at the bottom here, aligned up with the 45-degree angle ruler on my ruler. So I've got that lined up, and then I have the point of the ruler lined up with the point of our rectangle on the bottom. And I'm just going to give that a little trim and save this for later. Oops, gotta get that again. Alright, so now we're going to give this a little turn. And so our bottom is now facing the left. So I want to make sure that I again line my 45-degree line up with that side of the rectangle, and that my point is lined up with the point of this rectangle. And we're going to go ahead and give that a trim as well. And now we have a nice triangle that we can use to make our hourglass units in this week's or in this month's block. And the darker side is at the bottom and the lighter side is at the top. So now we're going to repeat that for all the rest of our rectangles. As long as I'm cutting, I'm also going to cut this square in half along the diagonal so that I can create my two halves of my half square triangles. And actually I need to cut this in half twice. So the easiest way to do it is not to move it like I just did. Just leave everything in place and then line it up going the other way from point to point. And now we have all of our 1/4 square triangles that are the same size as our pink ones. Alright, so here's a pro tip. When I was laying this out, what I did is I just took everything from the bottom and I started going with my darkest ones first, going all the way around that center circle. And then I started taking my top pieces and lining those up as well along the edges. Alright, now it's time to get started sewing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my sewing machine up to sew a scant 1/4 inch stitch. To do that, I've set it for a regular 1/4 inch stitch, and then I'm going to move my needle position 1 needle width to the right. That'll give me a little bit skinnier seam and a little bit more to trim off to make sure that these hourglass units are absolutely perfect. Now here is my tip, because I really like the way that this block looks right now. I like it with all the dark ones in the center and the lighter ones in the side, and I know that if I just start sewing these together with no rhyme or reason, that it's not going to end up looking like this in the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew one quadrant together at a time and then press that and move on from that. And what that will allow me to do is not screw this up, which is important to me. I like the way it looks. I want it to stay looking like this. And then that way I can just kind of control that process. If any of you guys are a little anal retentive about your piecing, then you will totally get what I'm feeling right now. So that's what I'm gonna do. You can do it that way at home too, or you can just sew a bunch of them together as you wish. But this is how I'm gonna do it. up this placement so badly that I went and pulled out my second smaller June Taylor cut and press, so that way I can just lay this right over the top of the blocks without messing anything up, and I can still iron. So for these hourglass units, I'm gonna break my pattern of pressing the seams open because I want those seams to butt up next to each other in the center so that I get a nice tight join so that the center of those hourglass units are just perfect. So we're gonna press both of those so that the seams are going underneath the pink side. Then when we flip them around, these seams are now going in opposite directions, which makes it really easy to get a really great join because when you press these together, the seams are just gonna lock right into each other, and it's almost like a little ridge that you can't push past. So when you pinch this, you shouldn't feel a gap or a bump or anything. That means that your seams are not together, but it should just feel nice and flat, and then you're ready to sew. All right, now I'm gonna sew along the center of that block using the scant corduroy seam. When I come to the center, I'm gonna remove my pin once that needle is firmly down in the other half of the seam allowance, holding everything in place. Then we can sew down the rest of that block. Now I am gonna press the center seam open just to help that block lie a little flat. If you've ever done an hourglass quilt and you just have these big bumps whenever you have seams joining, this will help prevent that. Look at that. That is a pretty good join. I am happy with that. So now we can put this guy back in place and we can repeat that process with all the other 4 quadrants. Every seam we sew together here is on the bias, which means even if we let the feed dogs do their job and pull the fabric through, sometimes we get a little bit of stretch. So the final thing I do whenever I make hourglass units or anything on the bias is I trim it up and I trim it to size. That way I know that everything is exactly square when I sew it together and my block is gonna lay nice and flat. So there shouldn't be too much to trim off when we're doing this. I want to make sure that my 45-degree line is going along this long middle seam and that my 4.5 inch lines on my ruler are ending where the points are. In this one there is, in this side it is not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that over a little bit with my thumb and just scooch it into place like that. And I'm just pressing, giving it a little extra elbow grease here to hold that in place. And we're going to sort of fudge it a little bit. All right, so we trimmed off that half. Let's move that out of the way. So now we're ready to do the other side. So now, since we just trimmed this half, what I'm gonna do is make sure my 4.5 inch line is even with both sides here. And my 45-degree line is still going across that center seam. And I'm still making sure that my 4.5 inch marks on my ruler are coming out right at the 4.5 inch marks, or where those seams come together for my hourglass points. Now we have a nice trimmed hourglass unit, which looks a whole lot better than this one. So I'm going to keep going around and trimming those and sort of keeping them in place as I go, so that way I don't screw up my order after I work so hard to keep it the way it's supposed to be. Now that we have everything trimmed, it's time to sew these together. And we've got some careful pinning to do to make sure all those points end up where they're supposed to be. All right, so I'm gonna roll these over, right sides together. And in this case, my seams are, one seam is pressed going underneath and then the other's flat like that. So one's going to the side and one is flat. So same way we've been lining all these up, I'm making sure that those center seams are right on top of each other, and then kind of looking at it from above and making sure they're nice and evenly spaced. And then I'm putting a little pin in to secure that. And we'll do the same thing on this side. Line those up so that the seams are right on top of each other. And then you can see from above, you can see that both of these are going this way and they're nice and symmetrical, and we're good to go. We can put a pin in there. Okay, now I've got to put my sewing machine back to a regular 1/4 inch stitch. We don't need that scant 1/4 inch seam any longer. All right, I'm going to go ahead and sew these through. So what I do is I always leave this pin in, take a couple of stitches just to secure that in place, and then I remove my pin because you don't want to sew over pins. You can break your needle and it can go flying. It can get a little scary. You don't want to do that. Then I sew all the way down to the bottom, get my needle firmly anchored in, half of that seam allowance, and only then remove my pin. So let's take a peek at those joints, see how they did, and pretty good. We've got nice joins where our points are coming together right where they're supposed to on both the top and bottom. So that's a really great way to pin. Now I'm going to press these so the seams are going underneath the pink hourglass units, the dark pink ones. For the home stretch, we have one more seam, and I'm going to show you how to use 2 pins to get that center absolutely perfect. So I'm going to flip these guys right sides together. And what I'm going to do is put my pin in right at the tip of where these are coming together, because I want my pin right at the top of that join where all these points converge. Now I'm going to put it right on top of where all they converge on the other side. All right, now that I've got that in place, that keeps all the points together right where I want them to be. I'm holding this pin in place with my thumb and my forefinger so that it's going straight up and down. If I were to rock this at all, then it would move the points so that one would be up further and one would be down further. And while I'm pinching that, I'm also putting in my second pin right in the seam allowance right next to it. And that'll hold everything in place while we sew. Now for these sides, we're going to pin that together just like we did when we were putting their individual hourglass units together. Just walking that seam up, making sure that they are nice and centered on top of each other. Then put a pin in the right side of that seam allowance and do the same thing on the other side. Give that a look from above. It's looking good. Put that pin in. Alright, so I'm going to take my first couple of stitches, as always, to get that seam nice and secure before I remove my pin. Go ahead and sew my 1/4 inch seam, and I can actually see where the seams are coming together. We don't have that thread Y, but you can see where the fabric goes off to at an angle past that seam allowance. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for, to be just to the right of where the thread comes off at a 45-degree line. I'll show you that once I get done sewing here. Let me show you what I did. So you can see where the fabric is going at a 45-degree angle once we pass the center seam here. So what I aimed was to be just 1 needle width to the side of where that happened. Let's check and see if that's it's about where it's at on this side too, which means we should have a pretty good join in the center. Let's see, this is a moment of truth. All right, so here's the deal. We got good joins on our sides, and this one is like in the last block where you can tell that they're centered, but we need to be about 1 needle width in, because right now you can see there is about maybe 32nd of an inch, if that, gap in between our points here. So if I just sew this again from about halfway in between the blocks, just coming in just a little bit, then it's going to make a big difference in how that point looks. Let's give it a try. All right, so I'm starting about halfway in between one side of my block, right on that seam allowance. That's exactly a 1/4 inch. Now I'm gradually coming in just 1 needle width or so to the left of where that thread is. Sewing over the center. Again, 1 needle width to the left of where the thread is. And now I'm starting to make my way back to the original 1/4 inch seam line, and I'm on it about halfway through. All right, so you can see what I've done here. I started about halfway in, right on that original seam line. I came in just a little bit, so that way I'm about 1 needle width in, just like 1 extra stitch of thread in from there, and then I went and leveled back out and finished about halfway through the other block as well. Let's open this up and see how we did here. Oh, much better. Look at that join, and it just took 1 little quick extra stitch and we are good to go. Just like all the other blocks, I'm going to finish this off with a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press to get it nice and flat. Well, here it is. I finished block 9 in the Dimensions Block of the Month quilt. This one's really cute, and again we get all this color change from one width of fabric. So cool. Love those Kinkame shades from Clothworks. Well, thanks so much for following along. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you know when we post other quilting video tutorials. It's not all about Quilt Addicts Anonymous patterns. We also do lots of quilting tips and tricks and how-tos. We taught you everything from how to sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam to binding your quilt. And we've got lots more to come. If you enjoyed this pattern, make sure you go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com to pick up your pattern book. It's called Dimensions Block of the Month, and it's designed by me. And we also have a limited supply of kits available as well. So you may be able to get one of those so you can make it in exactly the colors that we have available here. Thanks so much for following along, and happy quilting!